Welcome back. In a clear test of NATO resolve, Russia is massing troops on its eastern flank. It's a move that could throw Europe into chaos. Whether it will depends on what happens next. That is the hypothetical but not implausible scenario that we're going to explore today. And this being a business podcast, we're going to specifically focus on what the impact might be for business if it ever happens. In the current volatile geopolitical environment, it is the sort of scenario planning exercise that all businesses might usefully think about. And if that sounds extreme, think about the ongoing economic fallout from Ukraine and the global uncertainty still emanating from the Iran conflict. For business, faraway wars feel way closer than they used to.
Russia is a major state actor, also uses non-state actors to attack Europe. And so the conflict essentially is already engaged.
One of the first steps in that process is looking at business impact and what is acceptable, and it's going to be different for every business, and that could be linked to the financial impact, it could be linked to the customer impact, it could be linked to the impact on employees, but there should be, I say for most organisations, a defined point.
Joining me to talk through the potential impacts of a Russian incursion from energy to supply chain, I am delighted to welcome Luke Blake, a former police officer, founding director of business advisors Oakwood Risk Group. Self-described Russia geek and geopolitical risk expert Charles Hecker is with us too. He's the author of Zero Sum, the arc of international business in Russia. He's back for his second appearance on the podcast. Welcome both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Charles, who knew we'd be talking about Russia again so soon?
Very happy to be in my comfort zone.
For the purpose of this exercise, we're going to start this story, I think, about 6 months before the incident occurs, okay, where intelligence reports suddenly reveal Russian troops massing along the Polish border. Charles, the truth is, we're not a million miles away from that scenario right now, are we?
No, as horrible as it is to think about it, the scenario of a Russian invasion of an EU or NATO member country is realistic. And it's being discussed actively in defense circles and political circles throughout the European Union, across NATO, and on both sides of the Atlantic. And that scenario that you described reminded me of the scenario that we saw now 5 years ago when Russian troops were massing on the Ukrainian border. And the world was saying, nothing to see here, don't worry about it, nothing's going to happen. And it is highly unlikely that Russia would invade Ukraine. Well, we all know now how flawed were the assumptions that we were making about that buildup and about President Putin's intentions. But you're absolutely right, Philippa, to say that one of the versions of the future that we have to be aware of is Russian troop movements against a NATO country.
It's an impossible question, but how likely do you think it is?
Philippa, I'm going to try as hard as I can to avoid using the word likelihood.
Okay.
Just very briefly, because
how possible?
it is next to impossible. It's one of those things that we talk about reflexively. But I want to try to minimize the use of the word likelihood because I think it sets a trap for companies. Because when companies label things as likely or possible or unlikely, we tend to ignore or downplay the unlikely scenarios. And what we know is, not just from our experience, unfortunately, with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but with lots of other global crises that we labeled unlikely, is we become unprepared for them. What I can say is that this is a realistic scenario. It is one of a number of eventualities that companies on both sides of the Atlantic and in Europe and beyond should have on their sort of chart of incidents that, should have on their radar. And, while not saying whether I think it's likely or unlikely, it would, among other things, be what we might want to call a worst case scenario.
Luke, you're nodding.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think the phrase you mentioned at the start was plausible. And I think one of the mistakes that businesses can make with crisis management particularly is trying to give it a likelihood. The likelihood of this happening is 10%. It could happen in the next year. Whereas we tend to work on that, what is plausible. And I think if you focus on the plausible scenarios, you tend to have a better chance of preparing for them and hopefully responding to them moving forward.
I guess in this scenario, it is worth remembering we've kind of got incursions already, haven't we, in cyber, undersea cables?
That's right. We're having a lot of difficulty these days defining what conflict really is. And Russia is already attacking the West millions of times a day on the cyber front. But also look at what it's doing with attacks on infrastructure. Look at what it's doing with dragging undersea cables. In a sort of gray zone or hybrid type of conflict, Russia is a major state actor, also uses non-state actors to attack Europe. And so the conflict essentially is already engaged.
So, Luke, we're going to talk about scenario planning. We're going to talk about crisis response. But it does seem to me business could spend a lot of money running worldwide scenarios, couldn't they? How do you narrow down the most likely threat to your clients?
I think initially it's about having a good understanding of your business. So understanding what your supply chains are. A lot of organisations, they put a lot of effort and time into examining their tier one suppliers. So those suppliers that supply you as a business, and that's pretty much where they stop. And that's one of the mistakes that people can make. So I think one of the things I encourage businesses to do early on from this point of view is understanding where your supply chain stops and starts. Ideally, then looking at your tier 2, tier 3 suppliers and then trying to identify sort of pinch points and then mapping those suppliers in your supply chains or your single points of failure to sort of geographical regions. So if you have got, a critical supplier in Poland or in a country which is impacted by some sort of geopolitical tension or incident, hopefully what the impact is going to be on losing that or the impact of losing that. So that's generally a good starting point. It's just understanding your business, which is as simple as it sounds, is not always quite as easy as that.
Yeah, particularly when it comes to supply chain. Yeah. Should we take a look at kind of rational early steps? If we flesh out this scenario a bit, say we're running a medium-sized manufacturer, maybe a retailer, maybe not fully aware of, quite how long that supply chain is, which is, not unusual, trying to get to grips with these wider risks. When you understand your vulnerabilities in a way that you've just been talking about, you need to create a basic plan, don't you? Start building resilience. But I'm wondering who creates this plan, because you're going to need a team.
Yeah, I think one of the mistakes, again, people can make is trying to create plans for every specific scenario. So obviously we're talking about a very specific scenario here, but there wouldn't be a set plan for dealing with that. You're dealing with the impact. So when you come to creating plans, whether they're crisis response plans or business continuity plans, they are based around impacts as opposed to scenarios. So the scenarios will help you model what's going to happen, but actually your plans will help you respond to the impacts of something happening. And in terms of how that's done and who does it really depends on obviously the type and resources of the businesses that they have. So ultimately, as an organisation, we go in and support teams, internal teams, with building crisis response plans or business continuity plans or resilience plans. But ultimately, it's their plan to own. It has to be a business-owned thing. It can't be a consultant like us coming in and trying to write everything for a business. It has to be something that business owns because they have a better understanding of the business than an outside party.
Well, Charles, you spent a lot of years with controlled risks. You must have helped organisations build these resilience teams internally on many occasions. Who sits in the team? Who should sit in the team?
The more the better. Not to make a crisis management team unwieldy, but I think it's about buy-in. Inevitably, somebody will lead the process, and that may be the chief security officer, for example. But you really want to have a broad group of stakeholders who are engaged in the crisis management formulation and then the execution of crisis management plans. Because companies are complex organisms. And if you leave people out of the process, they'll feel that they've become part of the crisis rather than part of the solution. Okay. And so buy-in internally, even from parts of the company that may feel that this has nothing to do with them, is really important.
So how much of this do you communicate then to your people? Your wider people, all your people?
Well, I was about to say as much as possible. But what I would say is that people want to work at a company where they know that they will be looked after and the business will be looked after in the event of some sort of unfortunate incident. This was particularly the case during the pandemic. Because a global pandemic was deemed a low likelihood event, a lot of companies were caught off guard. And we saw companies using natural disaster crisis management plans to cope with the pandemic.
Which presumably were completely inappropriate.
It was not a one-size-fits-all sort of situation. And what happened there, not only for the operations of the business, but because this was a public health crisis, the employees of the company didn't really know what to do and how to interact with their employer and what provisions had been made, because crises are both external and internal. And so I think the company wants to cover, its messaging to its customers, to its supply chain, to its analysts, to the markets, but it wants to message internally as well.
What about clients? Do you talk to clients about these plans?
Yeah, I think yes. My view is always yes. Being open and transparent about your preparedness is a good thing. I think the level of detail you go into is obviously down to what you've got in your plans, how you're preparing for it. That is a business decision. But for me, if I was a client, and we are a client to certain businesses, I would feel much more reassured if I know the organisation I'm dealing with is preparing for this, and they're going through scenario plans, and they're developing frameworks around how to respond to this kind of thing. So I think it's a positive thing to share this information or share the fact that you're doing something around this. But again, the level of detail is down to how sensitive that information could be.
So you've got a team, you've got a basic plan. I'm interested to know at what point you put your plan into action. How do you know when the moment is?
I think Luke and I will probably both have answers to this question, but I think
Okay.
we're talking about different scenarios here, and we're talking about in this case a military scenario,
Yeah.
presumably in Eastern Europe or in the Baltics or somewhere in that sort of neck of the woods. And what you do when you construct a scenario is that you build into it a series of triggers, and you're monitoring them.
So if something happens, you do X.
That's right, and you're sort of to a certain degree ticking boxes, and as you get closer and closer to the execution of a certain scenario, the manifestation of a certain scenario, the idea is not to be taken by surprise because you've seen the triggers flip.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think what you said at the start, in that Charles, that the potentially some of the warning signs for Russia going into Ukraine were missed, and they're the sorts of triggers that we need to be looking at. Is to if you've got forces mobilising on a border, it's a fairly good trigger that something might be happening. Just on the sort of flip side of that as well is try not to get caught in terms of plan activation into too much of a rigid structure where actually you're just focused on these specific triggers or this specific threshold, but actually you've got some flexibility built into it. And that's one of my key points around crisis planning is flexibility and adaptability of plans. So not trying to get too bogged down in what is step A, B and C is having some decision-making flexibility so those in charge can flex with the situation.
What's your experience been of how clients have actually responded to this in the moment? Have they wanted to rush their plan into action, or have they been holding back? So, it may resolve, it's going to be fine, we don't need to do anything.
That's a very good question, Philippa. I think that, most companies are expected. I mean, let's put it this way. When two companies engage with each other, especially if there's a transfer of, let's say, intellectual property or there's the transfer of data, companies want to know that their partners are well prepared. And we encountered situations where two companies wouldn't do business with each other unless they had cyber crisis management planning in place.
Which seems rational, right?
And you want to work with and for companies that are on top of this and who are not necessarily trigger happy and afraid of what the future brings, but you want companies that will know how to respond proportionately, as Luke points out, but how to do it promptly.
I mean, it slightly depends on your appetite for risk, doesn't it? It's a bit like investing, because presumably it depends on what business you're in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are going to be some organisations that do pull that trigger, on a far more regular basis than others, depending on what their risk appetite is. There are some that, depending on the type of the organisation or the type of sector they work in, that actually incidents and issues they happen on a more regular basis, so they're less likely to pull that trigger. I think, from my point of view, I'd rather people escalate something, activate a plan or something similar when it's not needed than postponing the activation of it if it is needed.
Should we move our scenario on a bit? If we go maybe 3 months later in, we've got Russia launching drones and missiles into Poland. We've got it targeting critical infrastructure. We've got troops along the border still. At that moment, the world knows this is happening. Business knows this is happening. What sort of outcomes would you expect in that moment?
Well, we can make a few, I think, accurate assumptions about what might happen, and that is that Poland is already in real time and in the real world is signaling that if it is attacked, it is ready to counterattack. Poland is not messing around when it comes to Russian aggression. And so I think it would be likely, we're not quite sure that NATO or the United States is going to trade Chicago for Warsaw. But particularly now, but we can be, well, exactly, Philippa, I know exactly what you're hinting at, and I agree with you. But Poland is letting everyone know that it has red lines, and that if those red lines are crossed, it will respond. So we can expect engagement, and then we can expect, the impact that will have politically, economically, militarily, in terms of human resources, in terms of what happens to consumer behavior and how a country mobilizes itself. Poland is ready to do that even now.
So this is crisis management now, right? We're well beyond any sort of scenario planning. Thinking about the immediate steps that a business which has either supply chain or their own people in country or at risk, in territories that are at risk. It seems to me, tell me if I'm wrong, the first question for them is, what's happening with our people? And that's not just the people you brought in, right? That's the local people too.
Yeah, and I think that often gets forgotten. I think, if we, again, thinking back to Ukraine, when that first started to happen, we were working with some organisations that their first thought was obviously their expats in country and how to get them out. It wasn't always what about the locals and what's the impact on the locals. And I think, trying to bring those two things together is vitally important, because it's easy to extract, to a certain extent, it's easy to extract people out of a country. Those that are living there, how do you make them safe? And that needs to be part of, obviously, the planning process when you go into it. How are we going to keep our locals safe? Do we need to offer them alternative accommodation? Do we need to move the office location? Those kind of things. But it has to be, the people side of things, obviously, for most organisations, is going to be number one priority in keeping those people safe, and then followed hopefully closely by whatever critical services or critical activities you carry out in that region.
I seem to remember you had operational experience in Africa, Charles. Is that right? I'm just wondering what you've seen of this, how organisations, do they remember about their local employees?
Organisations have very short memories, but employees don't. So what I can tell, I can only emphasize what Luke said, and that is that when it came to Ukraine, companies should try to minimize as much as possible any kind of differentiation in the way that they treat local and expat employees. And, sending expats to the airport while not having a plan to cover what happens locally is would be a huge strike against the company, sort of reputationally and just in terms of its own security and operations. I'll push this one point further, and that is that a lot of companies should be concerned about whether their local employees, will be drafted or will be mobilized or will be called up if they're reservists, for example.
Yeah.
That is a realistic problem for companies that are entering into military preparedness or military action.
And this must be playing out and have been playing out in Ukraine in real time.
It was a massive problem in Ukraine. And that was one of the reasons why Ukraine essentially declared martial law. Literally declared martial law, shut its borders, and it shut its borders to men of draft age.
Yeah.
And so men were not allowed to leave the country. And then, there were companies concerned what's going to happen to our workforce. How many of our employees are going to be called to the front?
Because the draft age got older and older, didn't it?
They expanded the range of draftable age. They did that in Ukraine. They did that in Russia as well.
So
it's not necessarily just your young men.
Precisely right.
The others.
Okay. And people with particular skills as well. There's being concerned of that, especially depending on the type of activity you carry out in that region. If you're providing something which is linked to critical national infrastructure, for example, those types of people, those types of employees are again more likely to be drafted into some sort of war effort. So again, it's understanding what the demographic of your employee base is in that region is hugely important.
So assuming you're trying to keep your business rolling and you haven't actually pulled it out of the territory, these are difficult questions, aren't they, about you might have outright loss of suppliers. Presumably you've planned for fallback options there in your scenario planning?
I'm going to mix my metaphors a little bit on this, but I'm going to assume that most companies should understand or do already understand that, every company is going to have its own individual Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah.
And probably many of them. And that will be one sort of, or many particular choke points, as Luke pointed out when he was talking about supply chain management and supply chain prioritization. Each company is going to have its own sort of suite of Straits of Hormuz. And what you need to do is you need to understand what happens to a country's economy in conflict, how resources are reallocated and reprioritized, how people, as we've just discussed, are reallocated and reprioritized, what happens to consumer behavior in countries that are mobilized, and all of the different ways that a country's infrastructure changes, and weighing and hopefully anticipating, because that's the point of this podcast, anticipating those sorts of changes and building that into your company.
Yeah, I mean, it's a whole array of business impacts, isn't it? From, commodities, as you say, to energy prices, to people. As you said, there'll be a tipping point, won't there? At which point, continuing is unsustainable. But it's an interesting question, isn't it? What level of disruption, what level of cost increase is acceptable for a business if it sees its long-term future in that territory? So do you talk to clients about that sort of thing?
That's done very early on in the process. And I mean, it's often looked at from a business continuity point of view. One of the first steps in that process is looking at business impact and what is acceptable. And it's going to be different for every business. And that could be linked to the financial impact. It could be linked to the customer impact. It could be linked to the impact on employees. But there should be, I say for most organisations, a defined point, whether that be a financial figure or a time figure, of what's unacceptable. And that unacceptable, that phrasing could simply be, it's unacceptable to put people at risk of harm, or it could be it's unacceptable for us to risk more than £1 million worth of income. But there should be a predefined, set moment in time or metric there somewhere which says, all right, if we hit this tipping point, this is where we need to, this is where we can pull out, or this is when we can't sustain that model. But I think importantly with that, not everything's critical. And this is some of the traps that the organisations fall into is thinking they've got to produce everything all of the time, whereas understanding actually what is your critical activity, what is your critical service you provide, and can we scale down other things to support that, again, should be part of that pre-planning and scenario planning.
So adaptation.
That's right. And so not only is not everything critical, I would also add that, not everything is always black and white. And I think that there are opportunities here for companies to engage with their host countries. And, look, there will be certain things that governments will not be able to compromise on in a moment of conflict. But governments should be, and I think genuinely, and we saw this in Ukraine, are interested in keeping industry open and running so that, number one, the economy doesn't collapse, so that, number two, people who are not mobilized have employment. And so that, and there's an advantage to governments as well to having companies that can offer shelter, or that can look after young children, or that can look after the spouses of employees and employ the spouses of employees. And I'm thinking in particular of a client that we had that was in far western Ukraine that engaged with the government and said, look, we want to stay open. We want to keep manufacturing. We know that you're going to take some of our employees into the army, but where can we work together on actually finding a sweet spot that allows you to respond militarily to Russia, but us to also stay open economically.
So reserved occupations, all that sort of thing, and holding on to some of your people.
Yeah.
So that flexibility, that's an interesting point. I'm also wondering about other threats like cyber. Cyber, has become such a big part of all conflicts now. And I'm guessing, tell me, that, cyber incidents, they must ramp up at moments like this.
So back to this concept of what's conflict and how much of this sort of conflict is already ongoing. One of the things that it would be wise to anticipate in the scenario that we're describing is an uptick in cyber attacks. And, we've seen this in Poland. We've seen cyber attacks. We've seen physical attacks on Polish infrastructure on the railroads. And so I think that any sort of crisis management, any sort of crisis response, and I don't want to talk over Luke, has to have a deep and thorough cyber component.
I mean, presumably your risk profile in that area depends, who you're doing business with in the country. If it's government, if it's infrastructure, you must be elevated risk.
Yeah, and I think you're right. And I think there's good points there. I think it's not just focused on the cyber defence side of things as well. It is that cyber resilience piece. Like we do, most organisations do a huge amount of work when it comes to cyber defence and preventing the cyber attacks happening. But what we're seeing is we need to have a bit more of a shift towards cyber resilience. So what if something has happened, we haven't been able to stop it, and actually we can't access our critical systems? How do we respond as an organisation? And we've seen countless examples of organisations over the last 12 months being subject to those types of cyber attacks and not being able to continue to operate. So this is what organisations need to get their head around: is assuming a breach has happened and you have been attacked and something's happened. How do you now respond to that without your critical infrastructure in place? Which isn't easy.
Yeah,
but
easy
a lot of that comes down to scenario planning and exercising, testing, and training staff,
or at least looking the possibility in the eye in advance, presumably.
Some
just
people
almost
don't wanna say
psychologically.
that.
So that it's not a huge surprise in the moment. I mean, that's a admittedly brief look at immediate response. I'm wondering about the longer term impacts, because obviously conflicts roll on now. And We see this in Ukraine. We're kind of seeing it in Iran and others. So we see these cyber attacks rolling. We see energy prices rising and falling. There's a lot of uncertainty. We've got governments introducing emergency measures like tariffs and prohibitions and legislation. We've seen all this in Ukraine, haven't we? And then you can end up with travel restrictions, wider anxiety. So this is a kind of embedded period of long-term disruption. And that's a different phase for business, isn't it? So what happens then?
What happens then, I think, involves a real change in outlook and framework. And that is that the comfort zone that we all kind of lived in geopolitically for 6 or 7 decades after World War II is over. For a while, we were asking ourselves, well, then what comes next? Is there going to be some sort of new global framework? Is it going to be a world that is multipolar or bipolar, presumably between the United States and China? Or is it just going to be prolonged chaos and disruption, as you're pointing out? And I think that it's too early to say that there is some sort of new global framework being born. And I think the wiser outlook is to assume that we are in for a prolonged period of disruption and uncertainty. And the scenario that we're discussing today is one of a number of scenarios that companies should have on their radar going forward, because we're dealing with 2 major regional conflicts now, but we know that there are others out there.
Just sitting on the edge of possible as these. So yeah, Luke, what would you say about this? We're still in the territory. We're going to operate in this new normal. How do you do it?
That term new normal came out a lot in COVID, didn't it? And we went through that period of, a year or two of this new normal of lots of people working from home, and the way we operated businesses just changed overnight. And eventually we've gone back, hopefully, to what was normal previously to a certain extent.
The change has sustained, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think some of the changes have stuck, some have gone back for good or bad. But I think it comes down to that pre-planning, and crisis management isn't just a case of dealing with the initial impact, the initial incident or situation. It is about how we then recover from that and how we continue to operate. So it could be as simple as making sure that your communication strategy after, during that long term, that prolonged period, and when I talk about communications of both internal and external, how you communicate with your clients is important, being open and transparent and telling them what the changes are, how it's impacting them. Internally, I think it's just as, if not more important. I think the long-term crises are hugely impactful on employees and staff, both from sort of morale, a welfare, and a financial point of view in these situations. So having a strategy to deal with those 3 things is vital to make sure that they are on board and they are bought into the crisis response as well. But a lot of that just comes down to being open with people and communicating on a regular, consistent basis.
Philippa, it may sound like we're making a huge laundry list of headaches for CEOs and for chief security officers, chief operating officers, and the C-suite. We should just take 2 seconds to say that companies that can grip scenario planning and that can grip crisis management, planning and execution acquire enormous competitive advantage. Companies that do what we're talking about well and do it better than other companies, and the field is wide open, I think we should say, will perform better. They will perform better in periods of prolonged uncertainty and suffer less than they might have otherwise and suffer less than their competitors.
And you've seen this play out in real time in Russia, despite the sanctions and the rest. There are Western business interests operating inside Russia, legitimately, having found a way to do that. Business adapts, right?
Business adapts. I mean, you're absolutely right. But companies, as big and as cumbersome as they sometimes are, companies are learning, slowly but surely, thanks to listening to podcasts like this, they're learning how to be agile, and they're learning how to roll with the punches. And for some companies that have stayed in Russia under crushing sort of legal and financial and operational difficulties, there are reports coming out that some companies, not all of them, are doing pretty well at it.
What sort of sectors are they in? Who stayed in Russia now?
So what's not under sanctions? Russia is the world's most sanctioned company.
Yeah.
But you'll find that there are certain types of consumer products. You'll find that there are some, these sort of companies that travel under the radar, kind of mid-sized companies that aren't huge public global brands. The McDonald's left, the Starbucks of the world all left. But beneath that level of mega brand, there are other companies that stayed. And then there was also significant market entry from companies from Turkey, from the Emirates, from China.
So they filled the void.
Yeah, exactly right.
Isn't that interesting? You've come across this too.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to one of the points you were making previously around looking at, this isn't all negative. Obviously, this situation is very negative, but there are always going to be organisations that see the upside of risk. And we saw it in COVID. Some companies did extremely well during that period, and some flourished because they were able to look at it and predict and be agile and put a positive spin on what was happening and did very, very well. And it's exactly the same with this. Some companies will scenario plan and go, these are the negative impacts, and some will go, these are negative impacts. But actually, if we do this the right way, there's some positivity we can get out of this. There's some different ways we can operate to improve ourselves as a business.
So that is the further stage of the planning then, the whole kind of how do we, I hesitate to say turn this to our advantage, but how do we adapt in such a way that we can exploit the competitive opportunities that Charles was just describing?
Well, it's sort of, it's sort of a full circle moment for companies, and that is you plan for something, it happens, you survive, and then you go on.
We brought this very neatly to a close. I'm interested to ask you both, and I know it's a slightly impossible question. People listening to this, if they haven't really thought about it before in this particular context, what would be the first steps for them?
The organisations that come out of these situations well are the ones that have just put a lot of effort into pre-planning, and that is a very simple thing to say because there is a lot of resources, time and effort that goes into that. But first steps for me is always doing something like this. It's sitting down, talking through scenarios, coming up with plausible scenarios and talking about how they might impact us as an organisation, because you open up a whole can of worms in your supply chain, in your employee base, a whole host of things actually that gives you something to focus on straight away. So that is a continuous process, but it's often the easiest place to start and the one that probably is less costly.
Yeah, where are our vulnerabilities?
Yeah, I would call that critical uncertainties. A holistic, company-wide, multi-stakeholder conversation that's controlled, not messy and not unwieldy, but a controlled conversation about companies' critical uncertainties. What are the assumptions that we're making that may or may not prove to hold when things change? And then just taking it forward from that very basic first step.
That is extremely helpful. Thank you both very much. Really fascinating conversation.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
If you're an ICAEW member, remember to click through from the show notes attached to this episode to the ICAEW site. You can log your listen to the podcast as CPD before it slips your mind. Next month, with a new PM and a new Chancellor now in post, we'll be looking ahead to the second half of the year with our regular team of economic experts and asking them for their first stab at what the autumn statement might hold. They always have interesting takes on what's going on. Do not miss it. Thanks for being with us.